Combray, Part 10. That year my family fixed the day of their return to Paris rather earlier than usual. On the morning of our departure, I had had my hair curled to be ready to face the photographer, had had a new hat carefully set upon my head, and had been buttoned into a velvet jacket. A little later, my mother, after searching everywhere for me, found me standing in tears on that steep little hillside close to Tanzonville, bidding a long farewell to my hawthorns, clasping their sharp branches to my bosom, and, like a princess in a tragedy oppressed by the weight of all her senseless jewelry, with no gratitude towards the officious hand which had, in curling those ringlets, been at pains to collect all my hair upon my forehead, trampling underfoot the curl papers which I had torn from my head, and my new hat with them. My mother was not at all moved by my tears, but she could not suppress a cry at the sight of my battered headgear and my ruined jacket. I did not, however, hear her. "Oh, my poor little hawthorns," I was assuring them through my sobs, "it is not you that want to make me unhappy, to force me to leave you. You who have never done me any harm, so I shall always love you." And drying my eyes, I promised them that, when I grew up, I would never copy the foolish example of other men, but that even in Paris, on fine spring days, instead of paying calls and listening to silly talk, I would make excursions into the country to see the first hawthorn trees in bloom. Once in the fields, we never left them again during the rest of our Messageries walk. They were perpetually crossed, as though by invisible streams of traffic, by the wind, which was to me the tutelary genius of Combray. Every year on the day of our arrival, in order to feel that I really was at Combray, I would climb the hill to find it running again through my clothing, and setting me running in its wake. One always had the wind for companion when one went the Messageries way, on that swelling plain which stretched mile beyond mile, without any disturbance of its gentle contour. I knew that Mademoiselle Swann used often to go and spend a few days at Laon, and, for all that it was many miles away, the distance was obviated by the absence of any intervening obstacle. When, on hot afternoons, I would see a breath of wind emerge from the farthest horizon, bowing the heads of the corn in distant fields, pouring like a flood over all that vast expanse, and finally settling down, warm and rustling, among the clover and sainfoin at my feet, that plain which was common to us both seemed then to draw us together, to unite us. I would imagine that the same breath had passed by her also, that there was some message from her in what it was whispering to me, without my being able to understand it, and I would catch and kiss it as it passed. On my left was a village called Champyou, Campus Pagani, according to the curé. On my right I could see across the cornfields the two crocketed rustic spires of Saint André des Champs, themselves as tapering, scaly, plated, honeycombed, yellowed, and roughened as two ears of wheat. At regular intervals, among the inimitable ornamentation of their leaves, which can be mistaken for those of no other fruit tree, the apple trees were exposing their broad petals of white satin, or hanging in shy bunches their unopened blushing buds. It was while going the Messageries way that I first noticed the circular shadow which apple trees cast upon the sunlit ground, and also those impalpable threads of golden silk which the setting sun weaves slantingly downwards from beneath their leaves, and which I would see my father slash through with his stick without ever making them swerve from their straight path. Sometimes in the afternoon sky a white moon would creep up like a little cloud, furtive, without display, suggesting an actress who does not have to come on for a while, and so goes in front in her ordinary clothes to watch the rest of the company for a moment, but keeps in the background, not wishing to attract attention to herself. I was glad to find her image reproduced in books and paintings, though these works of art were very different, at least in my earlier years, before Bloch had attuned my eyes and mind to more subtle harmonies. These works of art were very different from those in which the moon seems fair to me today, but in which I should not have recognized her then. It might be, for instance, some novel by Saintine, some landscape by Gleyre, in which she is cut out sharply against the sky in the form of a silver sickle, some work as unsophisticated and as incomplete as were at that date my own impressions, and which it enraged my grandmother's sisters to see me admire. They held that one ought to set before children, and that children showed their own innate good taste in admiring, only such books and pictures as they would continue to admire when their minds were developed and mature. No doubt they regarded aesthetic values as material objects which an unclouded vision could not fail to discern, without needing to have their equivalent in experience of life stored up and slowly ripening in one's heart. It was along the Méséglise way at Montjouvent, a house built on the edge of a large pond and overlooked by a steep shrub-grown hill, that Monsieur Vinteuil lived, and so we used often to meet his daughter driving her dog-cart at full speed along the road. After a certain year we never saw her alone, but always accompanied by a friend, a girl older than herself, with an evil reputation in the neighborhood, who in the end installed herself permanently one day at Montjouvent. People said, "That poor Monsieur Vinteuil must be blinded by love not to see what everyone is talking about, and to let his daughter, a man who is horrified if you use a word in the wrong sense, bring a woman like that to live under his roof. He says that she is a most superior woman with a heart of gold, and that she would have shown extraordinary musical talent if she had only been trained. He may be sure it is not music that she is teaching his daughter." But Monsieur Vinteuil assured them that it was, and indeed it is remarkable that people never fail to arouse admiration of their normal qualities in the relatives of anyone with whom they are in physical intercourse. Bodily passion, which has been so unjustly decried, compels its victims to display every vestige that is in them of unselfishness and generosity, and so effectively that they shine resplendent in the eyes of all beholders. Dr. Persipede, whose loud voice and bushy eyebrows enabled him to play to his heart's content the part of double dealer, a part to which he was not otherwise adapted, without in the least degree compromising his unassailable and quite unmerited reputation of being a kind-hearted old curmudgeon, could make the curé and every one else laugh until they cried, by saying in a harsh voice, "What do you say to this, now? It seems that she plays music with her friend Mademoiselle Vinteuil. That surprises you, does it? Oh, I know nothing, nothing at all. It was Papa Vinteuil who told me all about it yesterday. After all, she has every right to be fond of music, that girl. I should never dream of thwarting the artistic vocation of a child, nor Vinteuil either, it seems. and then he plays music too with his daughter's friend. Why, gracious heavens, it must be a regular musical box, that house out there. What are you laughing at? I say, they've been playing too much music, those people. I met Papa Vinteuil the other day by the cemetery. It was all he could do to keep on his feet. Anyone who, like ourselves, had seen Monsieur Vinteuil about this time, avoiding people whom he knew, and turning away as soon as he caught sight of them, changed in a few months into an old man, engulfed in a sea of sorrows, incapable of any effort not directly aimed at promoting his daughter's happiness, spending whole days beside his wife's grave, could hardly have failed to realize that he was gradually dying of a broken heart, could hardly have supposed that he paid no attention to the rumors which were going about. He knew, perhaps he even believed, what his neighbors were saying. There is probably no one, however rigid his virtue, who is not liable to find himself, by the complexity of circumstances, living at close quarters with the very vice which he himself has been most outspoken in condemning, without at first recognizing it beneath the disguise which it assumes on entering his presence so as to wound him and to make him suffer. The odd words, the unaccountable attitude one evening of a person whom he has 1,000 reasons for loving. But for a man of Monsieur Vinteuil's sensibility, it must have been far more painful than for a hardened man of the world to have to resign himself to one of those situations which are wrongly supposed to occur in Bohemian circles only, for they are produced wherever there needs to establish itself in the security necessary to its development a vice which nature herself has planted in the soul of a child, perhaps by no more than blending the virtues of its father and mother as she might blend the colors of their eyes. And yet, however much Monsieur Vinteuil may have known of his daughter's conduct, it did not follow that his adoration of her grew any less. The facts of life do not penetrate to the sphere in which our beliefs are cherished. As it is not they that engendered those beliefs, so they are powerless to destroy them. They can aim at them continuous blows of contradiction and disproof without weakening them, and an avalanche of miseries and maladies coming one after another, without interruption, into the bosom of a family, will not make it lose faith in either the clemency of its God or the capacity of its physician. But when Monsieur Vinteuil regarded his daughter and himself from the point of view of the world and of their reputation, when he attempted to place himself by her side in the rank which they occupied in the general estimation of their neighbors, then he was bound to give judgment, to utter his own and her social condemnation in precisely the terms which the inhabitant of Combray most hostile to him and his daughter would have employed. He saw himself and her in the very lowest water, inextricably stranded, and his manners had of late been tinged with that humility, that respect for persons who ranked above him, and to whom he must now look up, however far beneath him they might hitherto have been, that tendency to search for some means of rising again to their level, which is an almost mechanical result of any human misfortune. One day, when we were walking with Swann in one of the streets of Combray, Monsieur Vinteuil, turning out of another street, found himself so suddenly face to face with us all that he had not time to escape. And Swann, with that almost arrogant charity of a man of the world, who, amid the dissolution of all his own moral prejudices, finds in another's shame merely a reason for treating him with a friendly benevolence, the outward signs of which serve to enhance and gratify the self-esteem of the bestower, because he feels that they are all the more precious to him upon whom they are bestowed, conversed at great length with Monsieur Vinteuil, with whom for a long time he had been barely on speaking terms, and invited him, before leaving us, to send his daughter over one day to play at Tansonville. It was an invitation which 2 years earlier would have enraged Monsieur Vinteuil, but which now filled him with so much gratitude that he felt himself obliged to refrain from the indiscretion of accepting. Swann's friendly regard for his daughter seemed to him to be in itself so honourable, so precious a support for his cause, that he felt it would perhaps be better to make no use of it, so as to have the wholly platonic satisfaction of keeping it in reserve. "What a charming man!" he said to us after Swann had gone, with the same enthusiasm and veneration which make clever and pretty women of the middle classes fall victims to the physical and intellectual charms of a duchess, even though she be ugly and a fool. "What a charming man! What a pity that he should have made such a deplorable marriage!" And then, so strong an element of hypocrisy is there in even the most sincere of men, who cast off, while they are talking to any one, the opinion they actually hold of him and will express when he is no longer there, my family joined with Monsieur Vinteuil in deploring Swann's marriage, invoking principles and conventions which, all the more because they invoked them in common with him, as though we were all thorough good fellows of the same sort, conventions which they appeared to suggest were in no way infringed at Montjovan. Monsieur Vinteuil did not send his daughter to visit Swann, an omission which Swann was the first to regret, for constantly after meeting Monsieur Vinteuil he would remember that he had been meaning for a long time to ask him about someone of the same name as himself, one of his relatives, Swann supposed, and on this occasion he determined that he would not forget what he had to say to him when Monsieur Vinteuil should appear with his daughter at Tansonville. Since the Méséglise way was the shorter of the two that we used to take for our walks round Combray, and for that reason was reserved for days of uncertain weather, it followed that the climate of Méséglise showed an unduly high rainfall, and we would never lose sight of the fringe of Roussainville wood, so that we could at any moment run for shelter beneath its dense thatch of leaves. Often the sun would disappear behind a cloud, which impinged on its roundness, but whose edge the sun gilded in return. The brightness, though not the light of day, would then be shut off from the landscape in which all life appeared to be suspended, while the little village of Roussainville carved in relief upon the sky the white mass of its gables with a startling precision of detail. A gust of wind blew from its perch a rook, which floated away and settled in the distance, while beneath a paling sky the woods on the horizon assumed a deeper tone of blue, as though they were painted in one of those cameos which you still find decorating the walls of old houses. But on other days would begin to fall the rain, of which we had due warning from the little barometer figure which the spectacle maker hung out in his doorway, its drops, like migrating birds which flew off in a body at a given moment, would come down out of the sky in close marching order. They would never drift apart, would make no movement at random in their rapid course, but each one, keeping in its place, would draw after it the drop which was following, and the sky would be as greatly darkened as by the swallows flying south. We would take refuge among the trees, and when it seemed that their flight was accomplished, a few last drops, feebler and slower than the rest, would still come down. But we would emerge from our shelter, for the rain was playing a game now among the branches. And even when it was almost dry again underfoot, a stray drop or two, lingering in the hollow of a leaf, would run down and hang glistening from the point of it, until suddenly it splashed plump upon our upturned faces from the whole height of the tree. Often, too, we would hurry for shelter, tumbling in among all its stony saints and patriarchs into the porch of Saint André des Champs. How typically French that church was! Over its door the saints, the kings of chivalry, with lilies in their hands, the wedding scenes and funerals were carved as they might have been in the mind of Françoise. The sculptor had also recorded certain anecdotes of Aristotle and Virgil, precisely as Françoise in her kitchen would break into speech about Saint Louis as though she herself had known him, generally in order to deprecate, by contrast with him, my grandparents, whom she considered less righteous. One could see that the ideas which the medieval artist and the medieval peasant, who had survived to cook for us in the 19th century, the ideas the peasant had of classical and of early Christian history, ideas whose inaccuracy was atoned for by their honest simplicity, were derived not from books, but from a tradition at once ancient and direct, unbroken, oral, degraded, unrecognizable, and alive. Another Combray person whom I could discern also, potential and typified, in the Gothic sculptures of Saint André des Champs, was young Theodore, the assistant in Camus's shop. And indeed, Françoise herself was well aware that she had in him a countryman and contemporary, for when my aunt was too ill for Françoise to be able unaided to lift her in her bed or to carry her to her chair, rather than let the kitchen maid come upstairs and perhaps make an impression on my aunt, she would send out for Theodore. And this lad, who was regarded, and quite rightly, in the town as a bad character, was so abounding in that spirit which had served to decorate the porch of Saint André du Champ, and particularly in the feelings of respect due, in François' eyes, to all poor invalids, and, above all, to her own poor mistress, that he had, when he bent down to raise my aunt's head from her pillow, the same air of pre-Raphaelite simplicity and zeal which the little angels in the bas-reliefs wear, who throng, with tapers in their hands, about the death-bed of Our Lady, as though those carved faces of stone, naked and grey like trees in winter, were, like them, asleep only, storing up life and waiting to flower again in countless plebeian faces, reverend and cunning as the face of Theodore, and glowing with the ruddy brilliance of ripe apples. There, too, not fastened to the wall like the little angels, but detached from the porch, of more than human stature, erect upon her pedestal as upon a footstool, which had been placed there to save her feet from contact with the wet ground, stood a saint with the full cheeks, the firm breasts which swelled out inside her draperies like a cluster of ripe grapes inside a bag, the narrow forehead, short and stubborn nose, deep-set eyes, and strong, thick-skinned, courageous expression of the countrywomen of those parts. This similarity, which imparted to the statue itself a kindliness that I had not looked to find in it, was corroborated often by the arrival of some girl from the fields, come, like ourselves, for shelter beneath the porch, whose presence there, as when the leaves of a climbing plant have grown up beside the leaves carved in stone, seemed intended by fate to allow us, by confronting it with its type in nature, to form a critical estimate of the truth of the work of art. Before our eyes, in the distance, a promised or an accursed land, Roussainville, within whose walls I had never penetrated. Roussainville was now, when the rain had ceased for us, still being chastised, like a village in the Old Testament, by all the innumerable spears and arrows of the storm, which beat down obliquely upon the dwellings of its inhabitants, or else had already received the forgiveness of the Almighty, who had restored to it the light of his sun, which fell upon it in rays of uneven length, like the rays of a monstrance upon an altar. Sometimes, when the weather had completely broken, we were obliged to go home and to remain shut up indoors. Here and there in the distance, in a landscape which, what with the failing light and saturated atmosphere, resembled a seascape rather, a few solitary houses clinging to the lower slopes of a hill whose heights were buried in a cloudy darkness, shone out like little boats which had folded their sails and would ride at anchor all night upon the sea. But what mattered rain or storm? In summer, bad weather is no more than a passing fit of superficial ill temper expressed by the permanent underlying fine weather, a very different thing from the fluid and unstable fine weather of winter, its very opposite in fact, for has it not, firmly established in the soil, on which it has taken solid form in dense masses of foliage over which the rain may pour in torrents without weakening the resistance offered by their real and lasting happiness? Has it not hoisted, to keep them flying throughout the season, in the village streets, on the walls of the houses and in their gardens, its silken banners, violet and white? Sitting in the little parlor, where I would pass the time until dinner with a book, I might hear the water dripping from our chestnut trees, but I would know that the shower would only glaze and brighten the greenness of their thick crumpled leaves, and that they themselves had undertaken to remain there, like pledges of summer, all through the rainy night, to assure me of the fine weather's continuing. It might rain as it pleased, but tomorrow, over the white fence of Tansonville, there would surge and flow, numerous as ever, a sea of little heart-shaped leaves, and without the least anxiety I could watch the poplar in the Rue du Perchamp praying for mercy, bowing in desperation before the storm. Without the least anxiety I could hear, at the far end of the garden, the last peals of thunder growling among our lilac trees. If the weather was bad all morning, my family would abandon the idea of a walk, and I would remain at home. But later on I formed the habit of going out by myself on such days, and walking towards Mességlise la Venus during that autumn when we had to come to Combray to settle the division of my Aunt Léonie's estate. For she had died at last, leaving both parties among her neighbors triumphant in the fact of her demise. those who had insisted that her mode of life was enfeebling and must ultimately kill her, and, equally, those who had always maintained that she suffered from some disease, not imaginary, but organic, by the visible proof of which the most sceptical would be obliged to own themselves convinced, once she had succumbed to it, causing no intense grief to any save one of her survivors, but to that one a grief savage in its violence. During the long fortnight of my aunt's last illness, Françoise never went out of her room for an instant, never took off her clothes, allowing no one else to do anything for my aunt, and did not leave her body until it was actually in its grave. Then, at last, we understood that the sort of terror in which Françoise had lived of my aunt's harsh words, her suspicions, and her anger, had developed in her a sentiment which we had mistaken for hatred, and which was really veneration and love. Her true mistress, whose decisions it had been impossible to foresee, from whose stratagems it had been so hard to escape, of whose good nature it had been so easy to take advantage, her sovereign, her mysterious and omnipotent monarch, was no more. Compared with such a mistress, we counted for very little. The time had long passed when, on our first coming to spend our holidays at Combray, we had been of equal importance in Françoise's eyes with my aunt. During that autumn, my parents, finding the days so fully occupied with the legal formalities that had to be gone through, and discussions with solicitors and farmers, that they had little time for walks, which, as it happened, the weather made precarious, began to let me go without them along the Méséglise way, wrapped up in a huge Highland plaid which protected me from the rain, and which I was all the more ready to throw over my shoulders because I felt that the stripes of its gaudy tartan scandalized Françoise, whom it was impossible to convince that the color of one's clothes had nothing whatever to do with one's mourning for the dead, and to whom the grief which we had shown on my aunt's death was wholly unsatisfactory, since we had not entertained the neighbors to a great funeral banquet, and did not adopt a special tone when we spoke of her, while I at times might be heard humming a tune. I am sure that in a book, and to that extent my feelings were closely akin to that of Françoise, in a book, such a conception of mourning, in the manner of the Chanson de Roland and of the porch of Saint André du Champ, would have seemed most attractive. But the moment that Françoise herself approached, some evil spirit would urge me to attempt to make her angry, and I would avail myself of the slightest pretext to say to her that I regretted my aunt's death because she had been a good woman in spite of her absurdities, but not in the least because she was my aunt, that she might easily have been my aunt and yet have been so odious that her death would not have caused me a moment's sorrow, statements which, in a book, would have struck me as merely fatuous. And if Françoise, then, inspired like a poet with a flood of confused reflections upon bereavement, grief, and family memories, were to plead her inability to rebut my theories, saying, "I don't know how to express myself," I would triumph over her with an ironical and brutal common sense worthy of Dr. Percipied. And if she went on, "All the same, she was a geological relation. There is always a respect due to your geology," I would shrug my shoulders and say, "It is really very good of me to discuss the matter with an illiterate old woman who cannot speak her own language," adopting, to deliver judgment on Françoise, the mean and narrow outlook of the pedant, whom those who were most contemptuous of him in the impartiality of their own minds are only too prone to copy when they are obliged to play a part upon the vulgar stage of life.